All right. Hi, guys. Thank you. It's actually perfect that Isabel was before me. She's a dear friend, and I'm going to tackle a little bit about the neuroplasticity of the brain. Not here to talk about Elon Musk's Neuralace or anything, or idea, or the fact that we're all in a simulation, though. Maybe posit the question, are we all in a simulation? Do we have any concrete evidence that we're not? I mean, just leave it hanging. But I'll start with a little video for those of you who aren't familiar with this idea of empathy, another buzzword in VR, but the transformative power of VR in connecting us. And that's particularly something I'm interested in. I work on business development for the Reality Center in London, looking at B2B enterprise, but mostly focused on healthcare and education. And I'm particularly interested in the brain, the fact that we don't know much about the brain and whether this technology can unlock the potential to maybe hack the neural laces of the brain. So, with that.
#VR.
So film, it's an incredible medium, but essentially it's the same now as it was then. It's a group of rectangles that are played in a sequence. And we've done incredible things with those rectangles. I mean, all the media that we watch, television, cinema, they're these windows into these other worlds. And I thought, well, great, I got you in a frame, but I don't want you in the frame. I don't want you in the window. I want you through the window. I want you on the other side. Let's talk about virtual reality. It's a very experiential medium. You feel your way inside of it. It's a machine, but inside of it, it feels like real life. It feels like truth. And you feel present in the world that you're inside, and you feel present with the people that you're inside of it with. And that's where I think we just start to scratch the surface of the true power of virtual reality. It's a machine, but through this machine, we become more compassionate, we become more empathetic, and we become more connected. And ultimately, we become more human.
So this is kind of the questions that I want to start with is, do we believe that tech does have the power to make us more human? Does it have the power to unify us or divide us? We've seen over the past few years, over the past year, particularly 2016, the rise of this idea of filter bubbles and the fact that we're all, through AI, not algorithmic, sorry, Brazilian, we're eventually getting to a point where what the internet was first designed to do, which is disseminate information and democratize knowledge, has, as potentially some say, led us to create walls and not bridges. I like to believe, and through the examples that I'm going to show, that actually that's probably not what I'd like to hope. That's not where we're going to go. I'm a traveler and a migrant and a child of dreams. When I was a kid, I started coding when I was 10, and I believe in the transformative power of immersive tech, virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, that it can actually connect us and unite us in a way that we've never been able to access before. This idea of what is reality and subjective reality, and how that how the interplay of that and the illusion of presence and what VR enables us to do is what I'm going to try to illustrate with these slides. To start with, one of the best examples, which I hope you're all familiar with, is Clouds of Isidra. So it was a UN-commissioned experience, which Chris Milk was a participant in. And this really exemplifies the power of VR in putting you effectively in someone else's shoes. So the idea is you're actually consuming content as an active participant and not as a passive. So what the video explained is we're moving, and I hope so, because a lot of people these days, you kind of go in the tube and people are kind of walking around like zombies with their phones, and I'm guilty of it. I do it too. But I kind of envision a world where technology becomes, so a little bit mixed reality, but technology becomes part of the world that we live in, and it enhances us and it helps us, but not in a way that we're kind of interacting with a 2D, two-dimensional object, but actually through it and around us. Obviously, that seems a little bit vague, so, and this cannot be more relevant than today. I think what Barack Obama last year said, that empathy is actually the biggest deficit in the world in terms of economic, social, cultural. In a way, we've seen this, and we've seen the ugliness of society to a certain extent, but in a way, it can, as we move from the information age potentially to the experimental age. And if you keep up to date with the Voices of VR podcast that came by, who's a big inspiration for the research that I've been doing, he kind of talks, goes deep into this idea of presence, and how body transfer ownership, which I'll talk about, can potentially help us eradicate cultural biases, maybe subjective biases that we have, because we've never really been able to experience what it's like to live in, to be in someone else's shoes. And I speak from experience. When I was 10, when I was 11 in Brazil, before I moved, I saw somebody get knifed to death in front of me. And in a way, it's one of those things that I can talk about it, and I can say that as a phrase, and I can maybe show if I had ever new photos, but I could never really put you in my shoes during that moment. But perhaps I can recreate it in a way that you're able to experience what the subjective sort of sensations of, what it was like to be in that experience. The same way that you can go to a refugee camp in Jordan, and experience a little bit more of what it's like to be in that kind of environment. And that, for me, is it's incredibly powerful. So that was me. That's my little avatar in alt space for International Women's Day. A little kind of toying around with this idea of social VR, and I have a law background, studied law at Cambridge, and another thing that I'm interested in is what is the consequences of them, sort of going more into ethics, but what are the consequences of your actions in VR? How do they translate into the real world? And what are potential, not to talk about regulation, but what does that mean for your self-image? A couple of the examples that I'm gonna go into talk about that. The idea of self-image, of building compassion towards yourself and towards others by literally putting yourself in someone else's shoes, which we've talked about as a phrase and as a concept, but we've never actually been able to experience it in the flesh. So Machine to be Another would be the first example. It's a visual haptic illusion of being a different gender, so it's a little bit between the intersect of art and science and tech. And in kind of experimental mode, it puts you literally in someone else's shoes by putting a camera and a headset. And you can, I think that the usual sort of examples and experiences are breaking down ages, different ethnic backgrounds, and it's a really, really, really powerful experiment in that. Just like to play it for a little bit.
The Machine to be Another is a long-term research project combining cognitive science, virtual reality, and personal performances to create in users the perceptual illusion of being in the body of another. Be Another Lab created this long-term project and seeking ways to better understand ourselves through understanding the other.
And due to time constraints, I can't play the entire video, but I love that phrase of understanding ourselves through understanding others. That encapsulates empathy and encapsulates what I believe is the transformative power of VR in this sense. We've got this idea of embodied cognition, another example of which is this experience which was at Sundance, and it was by the MIT Open Doc Lab, and effectively, it tries to illustrate this idea of it cannot be described, it must be experienced. So a complex issue like climate change and what we're doing to the earth can translate into a really rich experience where you, through haptic feedback, through a bodysuit, and both physical and virtual stimulations, you go into a nice kind of storytelling experience where you start as a seedling and you experience what it's like to become a full-blown tree, and then what it's like to get chopped off. So that, in terms of, I haven't experienced it myself, but it just immediately kind of shook me in the sense of you are the tree, and you get to kind of perhaps understand a little bit more. There are experiences where you get to see a first-person narrative of an animal, like a dog or a cow, and I just find fascinating that the kind of the windows that it opens in terms of understanding not just ourselves and others, but also the world that we live in, and raising complex complex ideas like that, illustrating them in a really powerful way. Obviously, this was enabled through this illusion of presence, which is kind of sort of sits at the heart of VR, at the core of VR. Embodied cognition, the rubber hand illusion, where you trick your limbs. You've got a virtual, like a rubber hand, and you stroke it, so sort of you've got your real hand hidden, and basically we're actually your brain is trying to make sense of the world and what it's seeing. So in that kind of feedback, it'll hack your brain. That's what we're doing with VR, really. The immersive virtual environments, the virtual human interaction lab at Stanford, is also raising those questions of, do everyday beliefs, attitudes, behaviors carry to the virtual environment? What is the relationship between what you experience there and what you experience in real life? Apart from a few research groups, no longitudinal study has been done. Like Isabel said, it's incredible to ask. We don't really know any conclusively what the longitudinal effects are on children's brains. But an experiment where preschoolers went into and were playing with orcas at an experience at Stanford, then after 2 weeks were asked to recollect the experience, and 50% of them couldn't distinguish between what was virtual and what was real. We start to see the responsibility that we have as people in the industry to create experiences that, to at least have that in the back of our minds as we're creating experiences in all different sectors, be it B2B or B2C, especially as it becomes more and more mainstream. Moving on to, as is a little bit more widespread and more well-known, is the idea of psychological treatment in VR. So treating anything from anxiety to specific phobias like arachnophobia. A startup company called Fearless was created by a founder who's based in Upload in San Francisco. And he created it for himself, just essentially to create a risk-free environment where he could somehow tackle the fear of spiders, not really thinking that within 6 months, he said he was able to hold a tarantula in his hand. And that's pretty staggering in the effect that can have, the impact that can have in our brain. Oxford, so I kind of identified like 3 strands, with startups, games like the plank experience, where if you've got fear of heights, you can walk and try to save a kitten at the end of a plank, and really your body believes that it's at that height, and it's quite scary. If you YouTube, if you Google it, you'll see videos of people crawling to get there. But it's really exemplifies what immersion actually is in VR. And Oxford ran an experiment where they were treating severe paranoia using going into an underground an environment where you can manipulate the avatar. So that's the beauty of it. You can in real time. So the creators of the experience can manipulate the subjects to all look at the patient, which is what the patient experiences in real life. But you're recreating that, so they start to understand that actually no, people aren't all staring at you. It's what your brain believes is happening, and this kind of goes back onto philosophical and existentialist ideas and the way that we understand what consciousness is, and that there's a subjective element which some people may have overlooked, or that we need to explore a little bit more in that it's not the facts that we're getting, but actually our interpretation of them. UCL also did a similar experiment with a group of patients of the NHS who suffered from depression, and the idea is to illustrate what your inner child, the inner child therapy is, and your patients were put into 15, I believe, so it was a small experiment, but very, very powerful. They were put into a room with a crying child, and using the bodysuit went and comforted the child as they would, however personal they would in real life, and then we switch perspective from the child becomes the patient, and they see a repeat of what they just done. So they see themselves coming towards them and hearing the reassuring words. So you're seeing you coming towards you and reassuring yourself in a way that is personal to you. And that within, I think, a month, 9 of those patients reported reduced levels of depression and increased self-compassion and compassion towards others. And this was a small group, so God knows what the potential impact of it is in moving forward. The Difficult People Project is an example of what Jonathan, who I met in a conference a year ago, was talking to me about this. This is just a hobby that he had and did, and he has severe ADHD, and is kind of an innovation specialist and a filmmaker, and he created short videos, 8-minute videos, where you can be in a business meeting as him, and he recreated his dialogue. So you can, and this was just for his friends and family, but the power, all of that for mental health and to to shed a light on different misconceptions. His mom has a strain of OCD, where she sometimes suffers from kleptomania. So he created a similar video where you walk through and that's the one that I saw, a supermarket experience, and to buy milk. And he recreated the internal dialogue that she suffers, and through sounds as well. He tries to recreate the whole sensory experience of what it's like to be walking around the supermarket and going through the increasing anxiety. To a certain extent, you can't really understand it, but this kind of gets to you a little bit closer. So I'll leave you with this this question: does it have the power to make us care more, to build bridges and not walls? And as we move forward, as VR becomes more and more mainstream, we need to, I believe we do have we need to have that in mind and be responsible in how we create experiences. Think about how the power that it has, but also perhaps the power, if we can't be naive enough to think that it will always be on the hands of the good guys. So I think VR can bring us together, and as an industry, I'm fortunate enough to be in an industry that I believe is thriving, is collaborative, and is moving forward in perhaps the most positive way possible. So thank you.